Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight we follow the slow tide of life in a Viking trading town set against the restless waves of the Baltic. Here the day begins not with the clash of swords or the roar of battle, but with the ordinary rhythm of dawn rising over wooden piers, timbered homes, and the voices of families stirring awake. Along the shore, the first fishermen wade into the shallows, their breath white in the cold air. Nets trail from their shoulders, heavy with seawater, dripping onto the sand as they are cast wide into the surf. The cries of gulls circle above, sharp and insistent, waiting for the scraps that will soon be theirs. A boy runs beside them, clutching a wicker basket nearly as large as himself, eager for the catch. His mother kneels on the stones nearby, her hands already wet with brine, cleaning the fish that come one by one, her knife flashing briefly as she works. The smell of salt, seaweed, and fresh fish drifts upward with the rising wind. Beyond the shore, the marketplace begins to stir. Wooden stalls creak open, merchants laying out their wares in careful rows. Strings of amber beads glint in the weak light, their color like trapped fire. Furs are shaken free of damp, spread wide for customers to inspect. Fox, beaver, sable, each pelt brushed smooth by practiced hands. A woman sets dough upon a brazier, flattening it with her palm, the bread hissing as it meets the hot stone. Smoke curls lazily above her. The smell of fish, wool, and tar from the shipwright's yard. The streets of the town are little more than packed earth, trodden down by countless feet. Children run barefoot through the mud, their laughter cutting sharply through the deeper tones of trade. A group of girls carry clay pots of water from the well, their tunics damp where the jars have sloshed against them. At one doorway, a woman shakes a blanket free of dust while her neighbor leans against the post, speaking in low tones, their words lost beneath the rising hum of the market. A blacksmith strikes iron in the distance, each blow ringing clearly, steady as a heartbeat. Inside the timbered houses, smoke gathers in low beams. Women stir pots over hearths, the smell of barley and dried herbs rising with the steam. A man sharpens his axe on a whetstone, his strokes slow, deliberate, the edge catching light each time it passes. Children carve small wooden toys in the corners, shaping boats, animals, or figures dulled by use, their shavings curling onto the floor. An elder sits by the doorway, carving runes into driftwood, his lips moving faintly as he whispers the words he inscribes, though none nearby pause to listen. The town breathes with the sea, ships creak against the piers, ropes tighten, gulls cry, merchants call, neighbors murmur. It is a rhythm at once fragile and enduring, each moment stitched into the fabric of a life that belongs not to sagas or kings, but to fishermen, craftsmen, and children, bound together by the tide and the endless hum of trade. As the sun climbed higher, the trading town grew louder, its sounds rising like a tide that touched every timber and every narrow street. The harbor was alive with movement, longships barbing in their moorings as men hauled ropes taut and shouted to one another across the water. The carved dragon heads at the prows stared out with silent menace, though here they were guardians of trade, not war. The groan of wood against wood mingled with the slap of waves, and the smell of tar and pitch clung to the air where shipwrights worked, hammering planks into place with steady blows. Boys darted among the timbers, carrying tools, their tunics smeared with resin, their laughter quick before fading into the steady ring of iron. On the packed earth of the marketplace, the bustle deepened. Merchants raised their voices to outcall their neighbors, praising the quality of amber beads strung like drops of sun, the softness of fur pelts spread wide on wooden tables, the sharpness of knives forged in nearby smithies. A man from distant Roos stood with a bundle of wax and honey, his accent thick as he bargained with a local for cloth dyed a muted red. Beside them, a woman from the south gestured to a heap of salt, her coins clinking softly as she pressed them into a trader's palm. Here, voices overlapped in a dozen tongues, the hum of exchange weaving a tapestry of languages as rich as the goods. Noise, smaller rhythms persisted. Children ran in packs through the narrow lanes, their bare feet slapping against the mud. Some carried carved wooden boats, launching them into puddles left by the tide, while others played with knucklebones tossed on the ground. A girl balanced a clay jug on her hip, straining against its weight, while her younger brother trailed behind, dragging a stick through the dirt to sketch crooked runes. A dog barked, snapping at the heels of the children, only to stop when offered a scrap of bread stolen from a mother's basket. The laughter of youth threaded between the cries of merchants and the clang of forges, softening the harder edges of the day. Within the houses, the work was quieter but no less steady. Women spun wool with spindles, their fingers twisting the fibers into thread, the rhythm so practiced it was almost unconscious. Others knelt over steaming vats, dyeing cloth in hues of red, brown, and pale yellow, their hands stained from the herbs and minerals they used. The air smelled sharp, metallic, and earthy all at once, rising with the steam to settle into the low rafters. In corners, children watched their mothers with wide eyes, their hands busy with small chores, sorting beans, stacking firewood, sweeping stray dirt into neat piles with straw brooms. Back at the shore, fishermen returned with their catch. Their nets, glistening with water, bulged with herring and cod, scales flashing in the light as they were dragged onto them. Stones! Women crouched at once, knives flashing, their hands quick as they gutted and cleaned the fish, the sharp smell of brine and blood filling the air. The gulls circled hungrily overhead, their cries harsh and relentless, swooping low to snatch at scraps thrown aside. A boy carried a wicker basket heavy with fish toward the market, stumbling under its weight but pressing on, his face flushed with pride at his task. The rhythm of the town was ceaseless, each moment linked to another. The creak of ships, the clang of hammers, the cries of gulls, the murmur of barter. It was not a rhythm of spectacle or glory, but of endurance, of meals prepared, goods exchanged, nets repaired, children soothed, songs hummed beneath breath. And as the Baltic wind pressed salt into every wall and garment, the town endured it all, its people bound to sea and market alike, their lives folded together in the endless turning of the day. By midday, the trading town pulsed at its fullest, stall alive with sound, smell, and movement. The sun, though pale through the northern haze, struck the rooftops of the timbered houses and glimmered on the wet cobbles of the narrow streets. Smoke from countless hearths mingled with the briny air of the sea, drifting in slow ribbons across the market. Here, beneath awnings of rough cloth, the press of bodies moved in constant tide, hands exchanging goods, voices rising and falling, the rhythm of commerce and survival. At the edge of the square, a blacksmith worked at his small forge. The bellows wheezed with each pull, sending sparks leaping as iron glowed orange and hissed when struck. The hammer rang in measured strokes, loud enough to turn heads, steady enough to reassure. Children lingered near, watching with wide eyes, though they flinched each time a new spark flew into the air. Beside the forge, a man sat filing a finished blade, running his thumb along its edge before wrapping it in cloth to be traded. The smell of metal, ash, and sweat clung to the space, a sharp counterpoint to the sweeter scent of roasted fish drifting from the next stall. There, a woman turned skewers above a brazier, fat sizzling as it dripped into the coals. She called out to passers-by, her voice rhythmic, practiced, her smile carrying through the smoke. The taste of salt and char clung to the air, drawing in men who stood shoulder to shoulder, coins already in hand. A young boy fetched flatbread from another stall, bringing it quickly back to his mother's hearth, where she spread the fish across its surface with practiced ease. Their small fire smoked heavily, but the smell was enough to gather neighbors near, who exchanged quiet greetings as they chewed. Beyond the food stalls, amber glowed in neat rows upon rough cloths. Merchants strung beads into long necklaces, their hands quick and precise. A woman lifted one, turning it in the light, its golden glow reflected in her eyes. She pressed it against her neck, smiling faintly before setting it down with a sigh and stepping away. The trader replaced it carefully, muttering under his breath in a tongue not native here, before turning to the next customer. At the harbor, the scene was no less vivid. Longships rocked gently, their hulls dark with tar. Men knelt upon the decks, repairing ropes or patching planks, their voices rising in bursts of laughter or irritation. Nets lay drying upon the shore, spread wide and glistening in the sun. Children ran between them, holding carved wooden boats, setting them adrift in puddles that gleamed with salt water. Their cries rose higher than the gulls, who wheeled and dove, feathers flashing white against the grey sky. Women crouched nearby, gutting fish in quick practiced motions, their knives flashing bright with each cut. Piles of fish grew steadily, to be traded, salted, or hung to dry in the smoky huts that lined the shore. In the narrow alleys between houses, smaller lives unfolded. A girl swept dirt from her family's doorway, pausing to rest her weight against the broom as sweat beaded on her forehead. Across from her, a woman stretched wool upon a frame, combing it smooth while she spoke softly to her daughter beside her. The girl twisted strands of yarn clumsily between her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration, her mother's hand guiding hers when she faltered. A man passed with a cart piled high with firewood, the wheels creaking as he turned onto the main street. Low as he urged the ox forward. Above, the rooftops shimmered faintly in the sun. Pigeons strutted along the thatch, cooing as they shifted from tile to timber. Smoke curled upward from the hearths, carrying with it the faint smell of stew, of boiled grains, of herbs gathered from the fields beyond the town. The sound of a lyre drifted faintly from one window, its uneven melody weaving into the din of trade. By the middle of the day, the town was at its height, merchants calling, smiths striking, fishers selling, women working, children running. Every life pressed close against another, every sound layered upon the rest, until the whole trading town seemed less a place of buildings and ships than a single living creature, bound together by the sea, by trade, and by the endless cycle of ordinary hours. As the afternoon wore on, the energy of the town did not fade but shifted, its rhythms deepening, its movements slower, steadier, more deliberate. The market still hummed with barter. Voices had grown hoarse, laughter softened, and the trades now carried the weary tone of hours already spent in sun and salt. Shadows lengthened across the packed earth streets, and gulls wheeled lower over the harbor, their cries sharp against the steady pulse of human voices. At the smithy, the glow of the forge had dimmed slightly, though the hammer still struck in patient measure. The blacksmith paused often now, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his face blackened by soot, his chest rising with heavy breaths. His apprentice, little more than a boy, hauled water from a bucket to cool the iron, the hiss rising each time as steam drifted upward in faint spirals. Around them, a few men lingered, their eyes tracing the edges of the new blades, while women passed by, baskets pressed against their hips, their pace brisk as they hurried toward home. The harbor was louder. Ships rocked against the piers, their ropes groaning with each movement, their sails furled and tied. Men repaired planks with mallets, the sound of wood on wood echoing across the water. Others squatted on the shore, sorting the day's catch into baskets, the silver bodies of herring and cod flashing like scattered coins in the fading light. Nets lay sprawled across the sand, damp and heavy, their knots tugged and checked by roughened fingers. Children ran among the drying ropes, their laughter ringing as they pretended to battle with sticks, their cries echoing against the prows of longships that loomed above like silent beasts. Along the streets, Trade continued in slower cadence. Amber beads were packed back into cloth sacks, their glow dulled as merchants folded them away. Furs, too, were gathered, shaken one last time before being rolled into bundles. A man closed his stall with a sigh, counting a small stack of silver coins, slipping them into a leather pouch before drawing the flap tight. Beside him, a woman offered the last of her flatbread to a pair of boys. They tore the warm loaves apart, crumbs scattering into the dust. The smell of smoke and ash lingered above the market, blending with the sharp tang of tar from the shipyard and the salt of the sea breeze. Within the homes, the work shifted toward the hearths. Women bent over clay pots, stirring grains and herbs into steaming stews, their movements unhurried but constant. Children gathered close, watching the broth bubble, their small hands eager to dip crusts of bread when given leave. In corners, men unrolled bundles of tools, setting them aside in order, preparing them for the next day's labor. One father taught his son how to carve a wooden comb, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones, each motion slow and careful in the dim glow of the fire. The smell of boiling grain and roasting fish drifted through the narrow alleys, seeping from every door, carried upward on the smoke that gathered thick against the low clouds. The courtyard spaces between houses filled with quieter moments. A woman rinsed laundry in a trough, her arms wet to the elbow, while two girls strung beads onto a cord, giggling as they dropped them into the dirt and scrambled to retrieve them. An old man sat on a stool, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, pausing now and then to rest his eyes on the children running past. His lips moved faintly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in song, though no one leaned close enough to hear. As the day tipped slowly toward evening, the town, weight of the hours, the sea glimmered faintly beneath the pale sun, gulls dipping toward the waves, longships rocking against their moorings. Smoke drifted steadily upward from 100 hearths, carrying with it the smell of fish, grain, wood, and wool. The sounds of barter softened, the cries of merchants fading, replaced by the steady murmur of families returning home. The town, once loud and bustling, bent now toward rest, its life folding inward as the light thinned. By late afternoon, the town seemed drenched in its own weight, the hours layered one upon another until every movement slowed. The marketplace was no longer the roar it had been in the morning. Stalls sagged beneath the absence of goods, voices had grown hoarse, and the ground was littered with husks of fish, stray feathers, and trampled scraps of cloth. Still, the pulse of life lingered. A final trade was struck here, a pouch of grain exchanged for a length of cured hide. A laugh echoed there, two neighbors leaning close to share a private jest as they packed away their wares. The clink of coins was softer now, the bartering gentler, but the rhythm of exchange endured until the very last moments of daylight. The harbor was the truest mirror of the hour. Longships rocked uneasily in their berths, ropes straining against the tide as the Baltic's cold waters pressed against their hulls. Men trudged across the damp boards of the piers, shoulders bent beneath loads of fish, barrels of tar, bundles of timber. Nets were stretched wide to dry, the evening sun catching the silver of scales that clung stubbornly to their threads. A group of boys raced between the piles of ropes, brandishing sticks as though they were swords, their cries piercing the air until they were shooed away by a weary fisherman. Gulls wheeled in great arcs overhead, their shadows darting across the water, their cries sharp and ceaseless as they dove to snatch at discarded scraps. In the narrow alleys between houses, the sounds shifted toward the domestic. Women swept the day's dirt from their thresholds, gathering straw and ash into small heaps that were carried away in baskets. Children returned from the well, their arms straining as they carried jars of water, their tunics damp from the spills that ran down their sides. The smell of hearth smoke thickened as fires were rekindled for the evening meal. Through open doors, the low murmur of families could be heard, punctuated by the occasional bark of laughter or the cry of a child scolded back from mischief. Inside the timbered houses, warmth gathered. Clay pots simmered on the hearth, filled with grains, dried fish, or the rare addition of meat. Women stirred steadily, their voices rising in quiet songs meant less for performance than for comfort, their melodies winding through the dark beams of the ceiling. Children sat close, waiting with wide eyes for bowls to be filled. In one corner, an old man traced runes into a piece of driftwood, his lips moved. Faintly, a ritual that had less to do with trade or necessity than with memory itself. Beside him, his grandson watched, eyes bright, though the meaning of the words carved was still a mystery to him. The smithy still burned, though softer now, its fire reduced to embers that glowed beneath the soot-black rafters. The blacksmith leaned heavily against his anvil, tools set aside, his body spent from the day. His apprentice worked in silence, carefully setting the forge in order, stacking tongs and hammers, sweeping ash from the floor with a bundle of twigs. The last sparks floated upward, glowing briefly before vanishing into the gathering dusk. From outside came the mingled scents of tar, fish, smoke, and sweat, the signature of a town pressed close against the edge of sea and forest alike. On the rooftops, the world looked different. The last light of the sun stretched across the horizon, painting the Baltic in hues of deep gold and grey-blue. Families climbed the ladders to spread blankets upon the thatch, seeking relief from the closeness of the rooms below. Children pointed at the gulls returning to their roosts, their voices hushed now, softened by fatigue. A woman leaned against the parapet, her hair loosened from its scarf, gazing out toward the line of trees beyond the town, her thoughts wandering farther than her feet ever might. Beside her, a man mended a net in silence, his fingers steady, the rhythm of his work unchanged by the passage of hours. By this time, the streets carried a softer hum. Merchants closed the shutters of their stalls, voices no longer calling, only murmuring as the day's accounts were settled. Neighbors offered each other nods and faint words of parting as they retreated into their homes. The earth, churned by countless feet, cooled in the lengthening shadows, while torches were lit at the corners of the market square. Their flames wavered, casting long, uncertain shapes against the timbered walls. And so the town settled into the slow descent of evening. The sea, once bright and loud with work, grew darker, its waves rolling steady against the piers. The gulls grew quiet, the longships swayed gently, and the cries of barter faded into the simple sounds of bowls and spoons, laughter around hearths, and the murmur of voices at rest. The day, vast in its labors, bent toward its close, carrying with it the unbroken rhythm of life at the edge of the Baltic shore. As dusk spread over the Baltic, the trading town, its weight from labor to rest. The sky deepened into violet, streaked with thin threads of gold where the sun lingered, and the water in the harbor mirrored it in broken shards, rippling as the tide pushed against the moored longships. Lamps were lit along the piers, small flames trembling in the salt wind, their glow casting patches of light upon the wet boards. The ships themselves groaned quietly, the creak of wood and the slap of waves filling the silence left behind as the shouting of merchants faded. In the market square, torches flared to life one by one, their smoke curling upward into the cooling air. Stalls that had been noisy and crowded only hours before now lay half empty, shutters drawn over bundles of amber, hides, and cloth. A few late traders still lingered, voices softer, bartering in murmurs rather than cries. Coins clinked faintly as hands closed over them, and then the figures drifted away into the gathering dark. The ground trampled through the scent of earth and ash, of spilled wine and fish, and the faint sweetness of bread baked that morning. Families gathered within their houses. Hearths glowed, filling the timbered rooms with flickering light. Shadows stretched long across walls as mothers served bowls of stew thickened with grain and herbs, as fathers divided flatbread into even shares. The children, weary now, ate in silence, their heads drooping as sleep began to pull at them. In some homes, quiet songs filled the air, old melodies carried gently from one generation to the next. The crackle of firewood, the scrape of spoons against clay bowls, the murmur of voices. These were the sounds that folded the town inward for the night. In the alleys between houses, neighbors lingered a moment longer. Women stood with hands still damp from washing, speaking in low tones across narrow gaps. Men leaned against posts, smoking pipes, watching the light fade from the horizon before stepping inside. Children were called back, sharply when their play carried too far into the darkening street, their laughter fading quickly as doors closed behind them. An old man walked slowly through the square, his staff tapping against the earth, his cloak drawn tight against the wind that carried the first true chill of night. The rooftop life continued as the stars emerged, faint at first, then stronger against the dark. Families spread mats and blankets to escape the closeness of their smoky rooms. Children pointed upward, whispering names of constellations half remembered from stories told at winter's hearth. A mother hushed them, smoothing their hair, while her husband sat in silence, gazing out toward the black line of the sea where distant fires of other settlements glimmered faintly. Pigeons shuffled along the thatch above, cooing softly as they settled, their wings stirring the cool air. The harbor grew quieter still. The cries of gulls ceased, replaced by the steady lap of waves and the low groan of timbers straining against their ropes. A fisherman sat alone at the edge of the pier, his feet dangling above the dark water, a knife in his hand as he worked slowly at repairing a net. The lantern beside him swayed in the wind, casting a narrow circle of light that flickered across his weathered face. Behind him, the town glowed softly, dozens of hearths burning behind wooden walls, the smoke rising steady into the night sky. By now, the trading town had surrendered to its quieter rhythm. Chaos of trade, the clang of hammers, the sharp cries of vendors, all had been folded into memory. What remained was the breath of the sea, the hum of voices within homes, the glow of lamps and firelight pressing back the dark. The day's labor, like the tide, had ebbed away, leaving in its place the fragile, enduring calm of ordinary lives carried gently into night. By nightfall, the town had withdrawn fully into itself, the wide hum of trade and labor reduced to a softer murmur that lay corners and behind closed doors. The narrow streets lay quiet beneath the pale wash of moonlight, their packed earth marked by the prints of countless feet, now empty save for the occasional shadow of a dog moving silently between doorways. The air, cooler now, carried the scent of smoke from 100 hearths, mingled with brine from the harbor, and the faint tang of tar still clinging to the ships at rest. The market square, so loud at midday, had become a hollow place of shapes. Stalls stood shuttered, their wares tucked away, the canvas awnings sagging faintly in the night breeze. Only a single torch burned at its edge, watched over by a weary man who dozed against a post, his cloak drawn high about his face. A jug lay at his feet, half empty, the smell of sour ale drifting faintly. From a nearby house came the sound of muffled laughter, brief and low, then silence again. The harbor was alive with quieter sounds. Longships rocked with the tide, their hulls creaked, their ropes straining softly with each shift of water. Lanterns hung from the piers swayed, their lights spilling across the surface of the waves in trembling lines. A fisherman moved along the boards, checking knots, his steps slow but steady, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Farther out, a few dim lights marked other ships resting in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the black sea. Above it all, the gulls were silent now, their shapes barely visible as they perched in clusters. Along the rooftops, wings tucked close. Inside the timbered homes, life drew inward. Families lay together on reed mats spread near the hearth, the glow of embers casting soft light over tired faces. Children slept curled against their mothers, their breaths shallow, and even while fathers muttered a last word or two before drifting off themselves. In one corner, a cradle rocked gently as an infant stirred, soothed by a mother's whispered song. In another, an old man sat awake, a little low, the faint scratch of his knife on wood the only sound as he carved simple patterns into a piece of driftwood. His eyes flickered toward the flames often, as though reading something there no one else could see. The rooftops belonged to the stars. Families stretched out on mats, gazing upward where the constellations had sharpened into clarity. The sea of night above was vast, pierced with points of cold fire, while the air was sharp with salt and cool earth. Children whispered their questions in hushed tones, but their voices soon faltered as sleep drew them under. A mother tucked a blanket tighter around her youngest, pressing a kiss against his brow, before leaning back beside her husband in silence. The town lay spread beneath them, a cluster of warm lights and drifting smoke, fragile against the immensity of sky and sea. Through every creak of timber, every sigh of rope, every flicker of lamp flame, the trading town endured the night as it had endured the day. Its heartbeat, slowed but never ceased, carried in the breath of sleeping children, in the whispers of weary parents, in the hush of waves against the shore. It was not the noise of battle or the song of sagas that defined it, but this, the ordinary rhythm of survival, the fragile hum of countless lives folded together beneath the stars, waiting for dawn to come again. Past midnight, the Viking town lay in a hush so deep that even the smallest sounds carried with weight. The wind moved softly between the timbered houses, brushing against thatched roofs, rattling loose shutters, stirring ash in forgotten braziers. The narrow lanes, beaten to mud by the day's traffic, had hardened in the cool air, their surfaces glimmering faintly where the moonlight touched. Dogs roamed quietly, their shapes flitting between shadows, paws soft against the earth as they searched for scraps. From time to time, a low bark echoed, answered distantly by another across the settlement, then silence returned. The harbor was restless, though no man worked there now. Longships tugged against their ropes, their hulls creaking like old bones with each shift of the tide. Lanterns that had burned earlier had gone out, leaving only the glow of the moon reflected on the black water. The sea whispered against the piers, steady, tireless, washing over the stones and retreating again. A fisherman, sleepless, sat alone at the end of a boardwalk, his cloak wrapped close as he mended a torn net in the faint light. His hands moved by habit, his eyes unfocused, the rhythm of the knots keeping him steady against the immensity of the night. Inside the houses, the firelight had dimmed to embers. Shadows filled the corners, broken only by the faint glow of coals, the red breath of heat that lingered long after flame had died. Families lay close on reed mats, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Children shifted in their sleep, murmuring, clutching at their mother's arms. An infant stirred with a soft cry, quickly, hushed by a lullaby whispered into the dark, the melody so low it was more a breath than a song. The air smelled of smoke and wool, of salted fish hanging from rafters, of damp wood soaked through by years of weather. In the courtyard, the well stood silent, its rope swaying slightly as if stirred by an unseen hand. A jug leaned forgotten beside it, its rim catching the moonlight, its surface beaded with dew. The old man who had worked there during the day now slept propped against the wall. His cloak pulled tight, his basket beside him unfinished. His head rested on his chest, his breath rattling faintly in the silence. The stray dog curled at his feet stirred once, lifted its nose to the wind, then settled back, its sides rising and falling with the slow tide of sleep. On the rooftops the world opened wider. Families who had climbed there for the night lay beneath blankets, their faces silvered by starlight. The constellations gleamed sharp, brighter than any torch or hearth. Below, their cold brilliance marking out shapes that fathers pointed to before sleep claimed them. Some men spoke in low tones, their voices heavy with the weight of trade, of rents, of tomorrow's work, words half lost to the night. Others said nothing at all, lying still with their eyes fixed on the sky until lids closed and breathing deepened. The children, long since surrendered to dreams, twitched faintly, whispering words no one heard. The whole town seemed to breathe together, ships groaning against their moorings, dogs shifting in the lanes, fires sighing low, children murmuring in their sleep. Above it all, the Baltic wind moved steady, carrying with it the smell of salt, smoke, and earth, pressing it into every timber and every stone. The night was not empty but full, a vast vessel holding the quiet lives stacked one upon another, bound together by wood, by rope, by sea. And in this fragile silence, the Viking town endured, waiting patiently for the slow turning of dawn. Toward the deepest hours, when the moon sagged low above the Baltic, and even the gulls were silent, the Viking town existed in a half-world between sleep and waking. The lanes lay utterly still, lit only by the pale sheen of starlight. Frost began to creep faintly across the damp earth, silvering the outlines of stones, catching in the grooves of cartwheels left behind. Every door was closed, every shutter drawn tight, yet the hum of life continued within, muffled and of breathing, sighing, shifting in sleep. The harbour, though quiet, was never lifeless. The longships moaned softly as the tide pressed and pulled, their ropes straining with each swell. The carved prows, beasts of wood with open jaws, seemed almost to stir in the moving light, their shadows trembling across the water. Nets hung like ghosts along the piers, dripping steadily into the sea, their fibers black and gleaming. Far out beyond the headland, a faint light glimmered on the horizon, perhaps another settlement's fire, perhaps a lone ship passing in the dark. It burned steady, small against the vastness of sky and sea, then disappeared into the curve of the earth. Inside the houses the hours stretched long. The glow of embers faded to ash, yet the rooms held their warmth, trapped beneath low beams and thick thatch. A child whimpered in a dream, startling awake, only to be gathered back against his mother's chest, lulled by her heartbeat into silence once more. An infant suckled quietly in the dark, the rhythm of feeding steady, unbroken by speech. In another house, a man stirred from uneasy sleep, reached for the knife at his side, then relaxed when he heard only the sigh of the wind through the roof. He lay back down, his hand still curled around the hilt, his breath slowing as the night reclaimed him. The courtyard sat in silver silence. The well reflected the moon, a pale circle wavering in its depths. The old man who had slept against the wall lay sprawled on his cloak, one arm thrown across his chest, his basket tipped on its side. The dog stirred beside him, lifting its head at every faint sound, the crack of timber, the cry of rope, the rustle of wings as a pigeon shifted in the rafters. Finding nothing, it lowered its head again, curling tighter, tail tucked close to its muzzle. On the rooftops, the stars burned fiercest. The blankets laid out there had grown damp with dew, yet families remained, too weary to climb down, stifling air of the houses below. Fathers shifted now and then, pulling children closer when they shivered, tucking cloaks more firmly around their shoulders. Mothers lay silent, gazes lost in the sky, their thoughts drifting far beyond the reach of the walls. A boy, not yet asleep, whispered to himself the names of constellations, repeating them until his voice grew slower, softer, and at last faded into steady breathing. The town as a whole seemed gathered in a single vast breath, drawn in. Dusk, held now in stillness, waiting for the first light. Every creak of ship's hull, every sigh of rope, every faint murmur within timbered rooms stitched itself into that silence. It was a silence heavy not with emptiness, but with life at rest, layered upon itself, bound in wood, in cloth, in salt. The world turned unseen, the tide moved ceaseless, and the Viking town slept on, cradled between sea and sky, until the faint grey promise of dawn would return to wake it. By the fire. Night the settlement lay suspended, the world wrapped in stillness so deep it seemed untouched by time. The air was cold now, sharpened by the sea, and every roof, every beam, every cart left in the lanes carried a thin sheen of dew that glistened faintly when the moon broke through drifting clouds. The streets were abandoned but alive with memory. Wheel ruts hardened in the earth, footprints frozen into mud, scraps of straw caught in corners where the wind gathered them. At the harbor, the tide had turned. The water lapped more insistently against the piers, slapping at the beams with a steady rhythm. Longships swayed with the pull, their masts groaning, their hulls creaking as if whispering in sleep. Ropes tugged at their moorings with soft cracks of fiber, but none came to tend them. The work of the day was done, and only the sea remained awake. A single lantern still burned at the farthest pier, its flame reduced to a pale glow, the circle of its light barely reaching the boards. Beneath, in that faint patch, a half-mended net lay abandoned, a coil of rope beside it, waiting for morning hands to take it up again. Within the houses, silence pressed heavy, broken only by the natural stirrings of sleep. Children shifted on reed mats, breathing softly, arms draped over siblings. A baby whimpered, quickly soothed by the weight of a mother's hand. In one chamber, a man muttered in a dream, his voice low, almost a chant, before falling silent again. The hearth. Faint embers, a soft glow hidden beneath ash, the smell of smoke lingering in the rafters, mingling with the scent of dried fish and wool. Shadows covered the walls, stretching into corners where tools and bundles lay stacked for another day's labor. The courtyards lay quiet, stones wet with dew. The well, silvered by the moon, stood untouched, its rope trailing slack, its bucket glistening with droplets. The old man still slept propped against the wall, cloak drawn close, his mouth open in shallow breath. The dog at his feet lifted its head now and then, ears twitching at the faintest sound, the rustle of a pigeon shifting on a beam, the whisper of wind brushing through thatch. Finding nothing to fear, it lowered its head again, curling into its own warmth. Above, the rooftops were spread with figures beneath blankets darkened by damp. Some slept soundly, unmoving, while others turned in restlessness, muttering faintly. A woman sat awake, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first grey edge of dawn just touched the sea. The stars still burned above, though paler now, fading one by one as the east began to glow. She drew the cloak tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the chill air, and watched as the black water of the Baltic began to shift with color. And so the town, wrapped in silence, drifted toward morning. The weight of the day's noise, its cries, its hammering, its laughter, had been folded into rest. What remained was the sound of the tide, the groan of timbers, the soft murmur of sleeping families. Fragile and enduring, ordinary and immense, the Viking town waited in stillness for the light that would summon its 1,000 lives back into motion, to begin the cycle anew. At the edge of dawn, the trading town began to stir, not with sudden noise, but with a slow unraveling of silence. The sky above the Baltic shifted from black to grey, then to the first pale blue, while the horizon carried a faint band of rose where the sun. Upward, the air was cold and damp, the breath of sleepers rising in faint plumes wherever they lay. The streets, silvered with dew, gleamed faintly in the growing light, their ruts and footprints softened, their silence waiting to be broken. The harbor caught the morning first. The tide rolled higher, washing against the piers with a voice louder than night's whisper. Longships groaned and shifted, their ropes tightening, their hulls knocking gently together. A gull gave its first cry shrill, and cutting, answered quickly by others that wheeled above the water, their wings flashing in the new light. From one of the ships came the sound of a man's cough, then the low creak of footsteps on planks as a sailor rose to check the moorings. His shadow stretched long across the pier, pale in the dawn, while behind him the net still hung dripping, ready for another day's work. In the houses, children stirred first. A boy rolled against his sister, murmuring, then sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mother pulled a blanket higher over the younger ones, whispering for quiet, but the spell of night was already broken. A baby cried, sharp and insistent, answered by the rustle of a cradle and the soft murmur of a lullaby. In another house, a man rose to stoke the fire, pushing embers into flame until the hearth glowed again, filling the room with warmth and the faint crackle of wood. The smell of smoke spread quickly, sharper now in the damp morning air. The courtyards awoke. Next, the old man stirred where he had slept against the wall, stretching stiff limbs and pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. His basket lay beside him, still unfinished, and he picked it up again with slow hands, his breath clouding the air as he worked. The dog shook itself free of dew and padded toward the well, lapping at the water pooled on its rim. Soon footsteps echoed across the stones as women arrived with their clay jars, lowering the rope into the silver depths. Splash loud in the morning quiet. Voices rose in greeting, weary but alive, and the first laughter of children chasing each other across the stones carried upward through the alleys. On the rooftops, the first lights spilled unbroken. Families who had slept beneath blankets sat up, hair damp with dew, faces chilled by the sea breeze. A boy pointed at the horizon, where the sun's disk just touched the water, a line of gold spreading wide. His father rose, stretched, and stood silent. Light climb higher, his breath steady, his eyes unreadable. Mothers gathered their children close, folding damp blankets, shaking them into the air before laying them across the tiles to dry. The pigeons rose suddenly in a great flurry, their wings clattering as they wheeled against the light, before settling again in softer coos along the beams. The whole town seemed to inhale with the day. Doors creaked open, shutters lifted, smoke rose from hearths, footsteps filled the streets. The market. Stalls would soon open, the ships would be readied, the nets would be mended, and the rhythm would begin again. For a moment, though, in that fragile breath between night and labor, the Viking town stood in quiet unity, its houses silvered with dew, its harbor shimmering, its people waking in countless small motions, alive, ordinary, and enduring at the shore of the endless sea. As the sun lifted fully above the horizon, the trading town shook free of night. Its timbers, soaked with dew, began. Dry in the pale warmth, smoke rose steadily from hearths and drifted into the morning sky. The streets, dark and glistening under moonlight only moments before, now revealed their clutter. Scattered straw, fish scales glinting like coins, smudges of ash, footprints layered one upon another. The first voices of day had become many. Greetings traded across doorways, calls from the harbor, the quick shouts of children already running barefoot across the hard earth. At the piers, life ripped, earnest. Fishermen knelt to untangle nets that had stiffened overnight, pulling them wide across the damp boards, shaking loose the last clinging scales. Their hands moved quickly, practiced by years, the rope rough against their palms. Boys hurried to carry baskets of rope and buckets of pitch, their faces alight with pride at being useful. The sea itself glittered with the first hard light, gulls diving suddenly into the water with sharp cries, wings scattering spray as they rose again with fish clenched in their beaks. Along the shore, smoke curled from low huts where the first catch of the day was already being salted and hung to dry, the sharp scent of brine and smoke filling the air. The market, too, awoke in layers. Merchants opened their shutters with the scrape of wood on wood, pulling out bundles of amber, hides, and cloth, laying them carefully across rough tables. The glimmer of beads caught the light like frozen fire, drawing eyes even from children who paused at the stalls before being pulled away by impatient mothers. A smith laid out tools he had finished the night before, their edges gleaming. Beside him, a woman unwrapped bread still warm from the coals, its crust blackened at the edges, its scent spreading quickly through the air. Already coins clinked faintly, deals struck in murmurs and gestures, neighbors pressing close to examine goods before the crowd thickened. In the alleys between houses, women began their routines. Buckets of water from the well sloshed as they were carried into dark doorways, splashing against tunics, leaving darker stains in the cloth. Straw mats were beaten against posts, the dust rising in pale clouds. Children followed, arms filled with kindling or bundles of wool, though many dropped their loads halfway in distraction, pausing to play with sticks or stones until called sharply back. The air smelled of damp earth, of smoke, of wool, layered one atop another until it seemed part of the very fabric of the morning. Inside the houses, the rhythm of work unfolded in quieter tones. Fires were coaxed higher, parts set over flames, grain stirred into thickening porridge. The sound of wooden spoons scraping against clay echoed through narrow rooms. Men sat sharpening knives or repairing harnesses, their hands steady, their movements wordless. Children perched nearby, chewing crusts of bread, their eyes following every gesture. In one corner, an old woman whispered as she spun thread, her spindle. Endlessly, the faint were barely audible above the crackle of the hearth. In another, a father lifted a carved piece of bone, shaping it into a comb with deliberate strokes, his son watching with rapt attention. The courtyards grew louder. The well rope creaked as bucket after bucket was hauled, water splashing onto the stones. Women exchanged quick words, complaints of prices, news from neighbors, small jokes that carried upward into the stairways. Boys leaned against the stone rim, tossing pebbles into the pool below, their laughter ringing as they tried to outmatch one another in distance. The old man who had slept there in the night worked again at his basket, slower now, but steady, his eyes narrowing in concentration as each reed was pulled into place. The dog padded around the women's feet, sniffing at dropped scraps, tail wagging as it was fed a crust of bread. From the rooftops, the scene stretched wide. The town was a cluster of smoke and sound, the Baltic wind pressing. The smell of salt and fish across its narrow lanes. The forest loomed dark in the distance, while the sea shimmered pale and endless. Families spread damp blankets over beams to dry, pigeons lifting in sudden bursts as children clapped and shouted to scatter them. A mother sat with her child, pointing toward the harbor where sails already stirred, explaining which ship belonged to which neighbor, which crew would sail east, which would return before the week was done. The boy listened solemnly, his eyes wide, though soon he was distracted by the games of other children, their laughter sharp against the morning hum. By mid-morning, the settlement was at full voice again. The clang of smiths, the cries of traders, the creak of wheels over stone, the slap of nets against the pier, the hum of women at their work, all layered into a single sound, the sound of a place alive. The Viking town, bound by sea and forest, carried itself forward into another day, ordinary gestures countless. Small lives stitched together in rhythm with tide and wind, enduring quietly at the edge of empire. As the morning lengthened, the trading town pressed fully into the living body of its day. The first urgency of dawn gave way to steadier labor, every street and courtyard filled with tasks that repeated from one sunrise to the next, each essential, each ordinary. The air was thick with sound, gulls shrieking as they fought for scraps at the harbor, children calling to one another as they barefoot through the mud, merchants raising their voices above the clamor to praise the quality of their wares. Down by the piers, work deepened. Fishermen bent over their catch, spreading fish across wooden planks, cutting swiftly with knives that flashed in the light. Blood and brine ran between the boards, staining the water below with red streaks that swirled into the tide. The smell was sharp and raw, carried inland with the wind until it clung to hair, to clothes, to every corner of the town. Women crouched nearby, gutting, cleaning, salting, their hands quick and sure, the rhythm of their knives as steady as breathing. Nets hung drying in great sheets, shadows weaving across the ground as the fabric swayed with the breeze. Boys darted among them, pretending the ropes were walls of a fortress, shouting with glee until driven away with sharp words. The market square was a tide of its own. Merchants called in overlapping voices, each trying to drown the others, the cadence of their words a chant familiar to the ears of all who passed. A bundle of furs was lifted, spread wide, shaken free of dust. Strings of amber beads glowed, catching the sunlight, glimmering like drops of honey suspended in air. A man held a small knife aloft, running his thumb along its edge before laying it down with a grin that spoke more than words. Deals were struck with hand clasps, with muttered phrases, with the dull clink of coin. Children lingered, watching, their eyes following every exchange as though it were a performance played out for their wonder. In the alleys, the quieter labors continued. Women bent over steaming cauldrons where wool was dyed in hues of pale yellow and brown, their hands stained by the herbs and minerals they used. Smoke rose from the fires beneath the vats, mingling with the scent of boiled plants, sharp and earthy. Beside them, a girl spun thread on a spindle, her fingers clumsy, her eyes intent as she mimicked the practiced motions of her men. The courtyard echoed with small tasks, broom strokes against stone, buckets sloshing with water, the creak of wooden doors opened and closed, the low murmur of neighbors trading news in soft voices that carried through the narrow gaps between houses. Inside, the homes breathed with steady rhythm. Hearth fires burned hotter now, parts bubbling with grains thickened into porridge, the smell of herbs rising with the steam. A child sat with a wooden toy in hand, tracing its edges while his father sharpened a blade on a whetstone, each pass leaving a faint ringing note that echoed in the dim space. An old woman hummed as she spun, her voice low, the tune fading and returning with each breath. Above her, strings of dried fish hung from the beams, swaying faintly with the draft that slipped through cracks in the timber. On the rooftops, the world stretched in balance. The sea shone pale blue under the sun, its waves breaking in soft foam against the piers. Beyond the fields lay the dark fringe of forest, its silence watching over the town. Pigeons strutted along the thatch, wings clapping when startled, settling again as children climbed to scatter them. Blankets hung wide to dry in the breeze, flapping like banners above the narrow lanes. A boy sat cross-legged at the ridge, holding a carved boat in his lap, studying the harbor below as if measuring where his toy might one day become a ship. By the height of morning, every sound, every gesture, every smell wove into one hammer and bellows, merchant and fisher, child and mother, dog and gull, fire and sea. The Viking town moved not in bursts of glory, but in steady, unending rhythm, 1,000 small acts layered into the fabric of survival, carrying the day forward in patient tide. By late morning, the trading town had reached its fullest stride, every path and courtyard alive with motion, every corner marked by labor. The sun, though thin and pale in the northern sky, poured enough light of the lanes to cast the long shadows of timbered houses across the bustling market square, to glimmer on the waves that pressed against the harbor piers. The whole settlement seemed to breathe in one steady cadence, ships rocking, voices rising, fires crackling, tools striking, its rhythm unbroken, its body whole. At the piers the activity was ceaseless. Fishermen shouted to one another as they hauled their boats higher, pulling dripping nets onto the boards, scales flashing like mirrors as they scattered across the damp planks. Women crouched low, their hands already slick with salt and brine, their knives quick as they split fish from head to tail. The smell was sharp, raw, inescapable, thickening the air until even the gulls cried louder, circling hungrily overhead. Boys carried baskets heavy with the catch, staggering under the weight, dropping fish now and then into the dirt, laughing breathlessly as they scrambled to pick them up again. Dogs darted close, snapping up scraps, their tails wagging as women shooed them away with sharp cries. The marketplace roared in equal measure. A fur trader spread a wolf pelt across his table, its grey sheen catching the light, while his neighbor lifted amber beads strung on cord, each glowing as though fire were trapped within. A woman roasted skewered meat over a brazier, fat dripping into the coals, hissing as smoke rose to join the haze already thick above the square. Coins passed from hand to hand, but barter carried. The trade, a sack of barley for a bundle of wool, a jug of honey mead for a small knife, a roll of dyed cloth for a stack of salted fish. The chorus of voices, layered in accents from distant coasts and inland rivers, carried through the air like a tide of human sound. Between the crowded stalls, children darted. A boy chased a dog, laughing as his feet splashed through puddles, while two girls clutched hands as they wove through the crowd, their clay dolls bumping against their sides. A group of older boys tossed knucklebones in the dust, their voices rising in quick bursts of argument and glee. Their games spilled into alleys, where neighbors leaned from doorways to scold, shaking heads but smiling faintly as the children tumbled past. The alleys themselves carried a quieter hum. Women spun wool with steady rhythm, the fibers twisting beneath their fingers, their voices soft as they exchanged news of kin and neighbors. Steam rose from dye vats where cloth darkened to muted shade. Of brown and yellow, the scent pungent and earthy, staining the very air. A man sharpened his axe against a stone, each stroke deliberate, the edge catching the sun. Beside him, a girl gathered shavings into a neat pile, brushing them into a basket, her small hands red from the effort. Within the houses the work was constant but sheltered from the crowd. Clay pots simmered on hearths, their contents thickening as the morning wore on, the smell of herbs rising with the steam. A child gnawed on. Crust of bread, crumbs scattering across the reed mat, while his mother wove strips of willow into a basket, her motions practiced, her eyes never leaving her work. In another corner, an old man murmured over carved runes, tracing each line slowly, his lips moving in silent rhythm with his knife. The fire cast long shadows up the walls, smoke curling toward the roof hole where it seeped into the open air. On the rooftops, the view stretched wide and endless. From here, the sea with white wings of gulls, the forest dark and watchful beyond the fields. Blankets flapped in the wind, spread wide to dry, while children clambered across beams, shouting to one another, their laughter carried down to the streets below. A woman stood with her hair loose, gazing out over the harbor, her hands resting on the shoulders of her son as he pointed toward the longships, naming them one by one as though he knew every prow, every crew. By this hour the settlement was at its height, market roaring, harbor clattering, homes steaming with food, alleys filled with work. Each life folded into the whole, each sound stitched to the next. It was not the glory of saga nor the thunder of battle, but the slow and steady tide of endurance, the pulse of ordinary lives at the edge of the Baltic, carried forward in unbroken rhythm beneath the pale northern sun. By midday, the Viking town pulsed like a living creature, every artery full, every corner marked by square swelled with people pressed shoulder to shoulder, merchants leaning forward over their stalls, voices pitched high to outcall their rivals. The cries were constant. Amber praised as fire caught in stone, wool boasted for its warmth, blades promised sharp enough to cut through oak. Between the stalls, smoke curled from braziers where skewers of fish sizzled, their fat dripping onto coals, hissing as sparks leapt. The scent of smoke, char, and salt mingled into one heavy breath that hung over the market like a cloak. At the piers, the pace had quickened. Nets draped across beams gleamed with silver scales, drying under the pale sun. Men hauled baskets of fish into the square, shoulders bent, legs steady beneath the load. Women salted the catch in barrels, their hands working so quickly that brine ran down their arms, soaking their sleeves. Gulls shrieked overhead, swooping suddenly to snatch scraps thrown to the side, their wings flashing white against the deep blue water. The sea itself moved steadily, rocking the longships as if in rhythm with the labor of those who lived beside it. Children, restless in the press of labor, spilled into the streets with games. Two boys tossed a carved wooden ball between them, shouting when it landed in the mud, splashing up their tunics. A girl dragged her younger brother by the hand, weaving through the crowd toward the brazier's smoke where her mother stood baking flatbread. Another group played with knucklebones, crouched in the dust, their laughter rising above the noise each time one bone fell perfectly into place. A dog darted among them, nosing for scraps, its tail wagging as the children laughed and tried to chase it off. The alleys carried a softer but no less steady rhythm. Women bent over steaming vats, dyeing cloth in hues of brown, grey, and pale yellow. The smell of herbs and minerals clung heavy in the air, staining not only wool but also the hands that worked it. Beside them, girls comb. Wooden teeth, the fibers softening, light catching on their pale curls. From another doorway came the ring of a hammer, a carpenter shaping a beam for repair, his mallet rising and falling with even cadence. Neighbors paused as they passed, exchanging a word or a nod before continuing on, their arms full of kindling or water or bundles of cloth. Inside the homes, the heat of the hearth grew stronger as meals simmered. Parts bubbled with porridge thickened with dried fish or beans, spoons. Stirring steadily, the scrape against clay rhythmic, unbroken. Smoke curled against the beams, darkening them further, filling the air with the familiar scent of ash and wood. Children dozed against reed mats, their heads heavy from morning play, while their mothers wove baskets, the reeds bending smoothly in practiced hands. In corners, men sharpened tools or carved small objects from bone, combs, needles, small trinkets to trade when the time came. The only voices inside were soft, soothe or instruct, to carry through the small space without disturbing its calm. From the rooftops, the town looked like a hive. The square was crowded, ships rocked in the harbor, smoke and steam rose from scattered chimneys. Pigeons wheeled in sudden flurries whenever children clapped or shouted at them, their wings flashing white in the sunlight. Blankets flapped where they were hung to dry, catching the breeze like banners. A boy sat cross-legged at the ridge, carving at a stick with a small knife, pausing often to glance down at the piers, watching the nets spread wide and the men shouting to one another across the water. His mother called from below, her voice rising above the din, but he lingered, unwilling to leave the view of the town in its full tide. By this hour, every sound merged into one continuous note: hammer and gull, laughter and barter, the slap of waves against hulls, the hiss of fire. It was the hour when the Viking town lived most completely, every life. Visible, every gesture threaded into the larger fabric. The sagas would never speak of these moments, yet they were the weight and measure of survival, the rhythm of trade, of work, of countless ordinary tasks repeated beneath the pale northern sun. As the sun climbed to its zenith, the Viking trading town seemed to exist in a single, unbroken wave of motion. Heat shimmered faintly on the damp earth of the streets, drying the morning dew into dust that clung to tunics and bare feet. Air was thick with mingled scents: brine from the harbor, smoke from the smithy, the heavy sweetness of roasting fish, the tang of dye steaming in great vats. Every breath carried the weight of labor, every sound wove itself into a vast chorus of survival. At the piers, the work reached its height. Men stood ankle-deep in water, guiding their boats onto shore with grunts and sharp calls, their nets dragging behind them heavy with the glimmer of herring and cod. The boards of the pier shone wet. Where baskets of fish had been dumped, their scales catching light like scattered coins. Women crouched in long rows, knives in hand, their movements swift and sure as they split fish from head to tail, throwing entrails into the sea where gulls swooped in a frenzy. The cries of the birds mingled with the shouts of men hauling barrels, and the creak of ropes stretched tight across timbers. Boys carried smaller loads, staggering beneath baskets of fish, proud even in their exhaustion, their bare feet slick with salt water and blood. The marketplace swelled into a roar. Merchants stood tall at their stalls, voices sharp, rising above one another, praising their goods in tones rehearsed through countless days. A fur trader shook out a pelt, the grey sheen rippling in the sun, while beside him a man strung amber beads, each glowing golden as though fire itself were trapped within. The glint caught eyes from across the square, drawing women forward, their hands lingering over the polished stones. A smith laid out blades, their edges sharp and clean, his apprentice holding them up to the light so the gleam caught attention. A woman turned skewers of meat on a brazier, fat sizzling as it dropped into the coals, smoke rising into the air with a hiss that carried even above the din. The smell of food clung heavy to the crowd, mingling with sweat and the musk of wool and fur. Children slipped through the tangle of bodies, weaving in and out like fish darting between nets. Boys shouted with laughter as they rolled a wooden ball through the mud, their tunics splashed with brown stains that no scolding would erase. Girls clutched clay dolls, their painted faces worn smooth from countless hands, carrying them proudly through the crowd as though they too were part of the trade. At the edge of the square, older children crouched in the dust, tossing knucklebones in games of chance, their voices rising in bursts of glee and frustration. Now and then, a merchant barked at them to clear the way, but they returned as soon as the space opened again, drawn by the hum of life too strong to resist. In the alleys, quieter tasks unfolded. Women bent over steaming dye vats, their faces damp with sweat as they stirred bundles of wool, drawing them up in hues of brown, yellow, and pale red. The air was thick with the acrid scent of herbs, staining their fingers and arms as they worked. Beside them, girls combed raw fleece, pulling strands smooth, their hands moving. Rhythm as though the motion were a kind of song. In a shaded doorway, a carpenter hammered at a beam, his mallet rising and falling with unbroken cadence, each strike sinking into the steady rhythm of the town. Neighbors passed, exchanging brief words, news of sickness, rumors of trade, the price of fish, before continuing on, their baskets filled with firewood or bread. Inside the houses, the heat of the hearth thickened the air. Clay pots bubbled, porridge stirred with dried fish and beans, the scrape of spoons against clay echoing through the dim spaces. Smoke hung heavy, curling upward through the roof hole, its scent clinging to every surface. A child lay sprawled on a reed mat, half asleep, the warmth of the fire and the fullness of food pulling him into dreams. His mother worked steadily nearby, weaving a basket, the reeds bending and snapping in her sure hands. An old man sat by the fire, carving runes into a piece of driftwood, his lips moving with each cut as though themselves demanded to be spoken into the wood. In another corner, a boy watched his father carve a bone comb, eyes wide as each tooth emerged from the white surface, the object transforming slowly beneath steady hands. The courtyards filled with clamor. The rope at the well creaked with every pull, buckets rising full and spilling over, water splashing against the stone rim. Women passed jars from hand to hand, their arms slick with moisture, their tunics darkened with wet patches. Chilled, crowded close, dipping hands into the cool water, laughing as they splashed one another until scolded away. The old man who had worked there through the night continued his weaving, reeds bending beneath his fingers, his motions slower but unbroken. The dog padded between the women, nosing at scraps, tail wagging as it received a crust of bread, chewing noisily in the shade. Above, the rooftops carried a different rhythm. Blankets hung wide, flapping in the breeze, pigeons scattering with the sound of wings whenever children clapped or shouted from the beams. A woman stood at the ridge, her hair unbound, gazing out across the harbor where sails stirred faintly, readying for departure. Her son stood beside her, pointing to the ships one by one, naming them as though he knew every crew and every journey. Below them, the town spread wide and loud, smoke rising in grey ribbons, voices layering until they seemed less like individual sounds and more like the single heartbeat. Thing. By this hour, the Viking town had become its fullest self, a chorus of hammer and fire, fish and gull, laughter and barter, woven into one seamless fabric. It was a world not of glory but of endurance, held together by countless hands, by ordinary labors repeated day after day. At the height of sun, beneath the pale northern sky, the settlement lived as it always had, its people bound to sea and market, its rhythm unbroken, its life vast in its smallness, enduring. Endless Baltic tide. By early afternoon, the town carried itself in a weighty rhythm, no longer the frenzied burst of morning trade, but a steadier current, heavy with heat, smoke, and labor. The pale northern sun stood high, bleaching the roofs and drying the last of the morning's damp from the lanes. Dust clung to ankles and tunics, stirred with each step, settling again in the creases of timber walls and between the stones of the square. The air was thick, of brine, of sweat, of hearth smoke, of tar from the shipyard, and every breath seemed to taste of labor. At the harbor, the scene was relentless. Barrels of salted fish were rolled into lines, bound with rope, marked with crude signs of ownership. The piers groaned under the weight of men hauling crates of timber, their shoulders bent, their hands raw from rope. Shipwrights hammered steadily, their mallets sinking iron nails deep into new planks, the sound carrying sharp and hollow over the water. Children lingered near, pointing. At the rising hull of a half-built ship, its skeleton stark against the horizon. Gulls dove low, fearless, darting between ropes and beams to snatch scraps from the nets still drying in the sun. Their wings clattered loud enough to drown even the voices of men shouting across the water. The market was swollen with noise and heat. Furs lay piled in heaps, their musky scent heavy in the air, fox and beaver and otter stacked side by side. Amber beads glowed as though lit from within, the color. Trapped honey catching the eyes of every passerby. A smith held a blade aloft, its edge sharp as light itself, while his apprentice carried buckets of water, spilling trails across the dirt as he moved. Women clustered near the food stalls, flatbread and fish wrapped in cloth, the smell rich enough to cling to hair and skin long after it was eaten. The cries of merchants overlapped until they became a chant without pause, the language shifting from tongue to tongue, every syllable pressed into the air with equal urgency. Children threaded through the crowd with a freedom that no adult had. A girl clutched a clay doll against her chest, its painted face worn to a blur, while her brother carried a stick like a sword, striking it against stalls as he passed. Older boys huddled together over a game of dice, their laughter loud and reckless, scattering when a merchant's hand rose in warning. A pack of dogs followed them, snapping at one another, their tails high, their noses quick to scraps beneath the tables. In the alleys, quieter lives carried on. Women leaned over vats where wool darkened in dye, the steam rising thick, leaving their arms and faces wet. The smell was sharp, clinging, staining skin as surely as it did the cloth. Beside them, girls twisted fibers into thread, their voices quick with gossip, their laughter light despite the weight of work. From a doorway came the sound of carving, a man splitting bone into long, thin combs, the shavings curling onto the ground in pale curls. A neighbor paused to watch, nodding once in approval before vanishing again into the press of the lane. Inside the houses, shadows stretched though the hearths burned hot. Pots bubbled steadily, porridge thickening with dried beans, stew simmering with herbs, the smell rich and filling. An old woman hummed a low tune as she spun, her spindle whirring without pause, her voice fading in and out with her breath. Children sat with small tasks, sorting beans, gathering wood, brushing crumbs into neat piles with straw brooms. Each movement slow, patient, the labor of hands too small to yet know weariness. Men carved at handles, sharpened knives, patched shoes, each working in silence, the scrape of their tools filling the dim rooms. The courtyards were busier still. Buckets thumped against the stones of the well, water splashing into clay jars that glistened in the sun. Women bent their backs, lifting the heavy loads with practiced ease, voices carrying in low. Conversation. A boy tried to haul one himself, the rope burning his hands, his laughter ringing even as he stumbled. The old man with his basket remained in his place, weaving steadily, his dog stretched in the shade beside him, tail twitching as it dreamed. From the rooftops, the town spread like a living map, piers alive with gulls and men, the square roaring with trade, the alleys humming with work. Smoke rose in countless thin ribbons, drifting into the sky until it blurred with clouds. Blankets flapped like banners, pigeons wheeled in sudden bursts, their shadows racing across the thatch. A girl sat cross-legged at the ridge, pointing out the sails gathering at the horizon, whispering their names as though she could call them closer. By this hour the settlement was vast in its ordinariness, 1,000 lives moving in cadence, each sound layered upon the rest until no silence remained. It was not battle that marked the heart of the town, nor song, nor glory, but this, the steady weight of countless hands, the endless tide of tasks, the breath of a people bound together by sea, by trade, by the fragile threads of daily endurance. As the afternoon waned, the trading town settled into a slower, heavier rhythm, its earlier urgency easing into the calm of work completed. The sun slanted low across the Baltic, casting long shadows of ships upon the water, gilding the roofs with pale gold. The air cooled with the shift, though the scents of fish, tar, and smokes hung thick, clinging to every garment and timber. Voices softened. Where the market had once roared, now it murmured, trade struck with little more than nods and half-raised hands. Stalls shuttered one by one, amber beads folded into cloth, furs rolled tight, bread sold to its last crumb. At the harbor, barrels of salted fish stood in neat rows, their lids sealed, their weight ready for the holds of ships. Nets hung empty now, dripping in the last light, while gulls settled along the beams. Their cries less frantic, their wings folding for rest. A boy swept scales from the boards into the water, watching as they drifted like sparks across the tide before vanishing into the sea. Men wiped their hands on their tunics, shoulders slack, their laughter faint as they spoke of tomorrow's work. The longships swayed gently, their prows casting stretched shadows across the water, the ropes creaking in time with the tide. In the courtyards, buckets thudded against stone for the last time. That day, jars of water hauled inside before the cool night descended. Women gathered laundry from the lines, shaking out the damp and folding it into neat stacks. The old man finished his weaving, setting the basket aside with a sigh, his hands stilling at last as the dog rested its head against his knee. Children's play quieted to softer tones, their energy worn down by the day. Their games shrank to whispers, to toys drawn close, to laughter that no longer rang but hummed. Within them, the hearths grew brighter again, flames rising for the evening meal. Clay pots simmered with stews rich from the day's labor, herbs steeped deep into broth, fish and beans thickened to fill weary stomachs. Shadows danced across the walls as families gathered close, reed mats spread with bowls and bread. The sound was gentle, spoons scraping, quiet voices, the occasional laugh at a child's mischief. Smoke curled upward, slipping through the roof holes to join the dimming sky, carrying with it the warmth of countless homes. On the rooftops, the last of the light lingered. Families leaned together, their blankets spread wide, watching as the horizon darkened. Children pointed at sails far out to sea, whispering guesses of where they had come from, where they might go. Mothers hushed them, brushing hair from small foreheads, while fathers sat in silence, gazes fixed on the shifting line between water and sky. Pigeons cooed in low chorus, wings settling, feathers ruffling as they sank into stillness. And as the first stars emerged, faint and cold above the smoke, the town released the weight of its day. The cries of merchants were gone, the clang of hammers silenced, the laughter of children folded into murmurs. What remained was the steady hush of the tide, the groan of ships at rest, the low hum of families gathered by firelight. Fragile yet enduring, bound to the sea and to each other, the Viking town yielded to night, its thousand small labors folded neatly into May, waiting for dawn to call them forth once more.